The Galactic Administrative Council had many virtues. Efficiency was not among them. Neither was common sense. But that hardly mattered when you controlled 17,000 inhabited systems with the bureaucratic finesse of a caffeinated sloth operating heavy machinery. The morning's entertainment arrived via quantum pulse transmission, delivered with all the ceremonial pomp of a tax notice. The holographic seal materialized above the breakfast table with a pompous little flourish, interrupting what had been a perfectly reasonable conversation about the mating habits of Centaurian slug beetles. The protagonist of our tale, let's call them the Wanderer, since the universe had never bothered to assign them a proper designation, paused mid-bite of synthesized protein paste that claimed to taste like Terran bacon, but had all the culinary authenticity of recycled starship hull plating. Citizen designation human variant unregistered. The hologram announced in that insufferably cheerful tone reserved for automated systems designed by beings who had clearly never experienced genuine irritation. You are hereby required to report to your homeworld of origin for mandatory cultural reintegration assessment and species compliance verification. The Wanderer stared at the floating bureaucratic nightmare with the sort of expression typically reserved for discovering your pet had just devoured your life's work. Around the communal eating space, their current housemates, a delightfully diverse collection of crystalline entity, gaseous philosophers, and one particularly argumentative cephalopod, continued their daily routines with the practiced indifference of beings who had seen the galaxy's administrative incompetence in action before. Homeworld, the Wanderer repeated slowly, as if testing the word for structural integrity. Right, of course. The hologram, blissfully unaware of the existential crisis it had just triggered, continued its rehearsed spiel. Transportation to Earth designation Sol 3 has been arranged. Departure scheduled for next solar cycle. Failure to comply will result in citizenship status review and possible deportation to species of origin. This was where most rational beings would have pointed out the obvious flaw in the logic, namely that being deported to one's species of origin when one had never actually been there, created a paradox that would make quantum physicists weep into their probability equation. But the Galactic Administrative Council had elevated the art of circular reasoning to new and terrifying heights. The Wanderer had been raised by the galaxy itself, passed from species to species like a particularly confusing baton in a relay race. Nobody remembered start. First, the crystalline architects of Vega Prime had found them as an infant, drifting in an escape pod with all the documentation of a ghost story. They had taught them to think in geometric patterns, and appreciate the subtle beauty of molecular structure. Then came the aquatic depths dwellers of Kepler 422b, who had gifted them with an understanding of pressure dynamics and the philosophy of fluid motion. The nomadic cloud riders of the Horsehead Nebula had shown them navigation by stellar wind and the art of reading cosmic radiation like poetry. Each species had contributed something to their education, creating a being who could discuss quantum mechanics with crystalline mathematicians, debate ethics with gaseous philosophers, and navigate stellar phenomena with beings made of living plasma. They were, by any reasonable measure, a walking testament to galactic cooperation and cultural exchange. Unfortunately, the Galactic Administrative Council wasn't known for reasonable measure. "This is spectacular," the Wanderer muttered, watching the hologram cycle through its mandatory legal disclaimers with the enthusiasm of a dying star. "They want me to go home to a planet I've never seen, to rejoin a culture I've never experienced, because some cosmic filing clerk decided that genetic similarity equals cultural belonging." The argumentative cephalopod, currently engaged in what appeared to be a heated debate with a sentient gas cloud about the philosophical implications of breakfast, paused long enough to offer a gesture that roughly translated to "bureaucrats are the universe's way of testing our commitment to nonviolence." The Wanderer appreciated the solidarity, but it didn't solve the fundamental problem. Earth, the legendary birth world of humanity, subject of countless alien anthropological studies and approximately 12,000 terrible holographic documentaries. They knew the basic facts: blue planet, excessive water content, populated by beings who had somehow managed to achieve interstellar travel, despite an alarming tendency toward self-destruction. The theoretical knowledge was extensive. The practical experience was precisely zero. According to galactic records, humans were supposed to possess certain instinctual behaviors: territorial aggression, pack bonding, an inexplicable fondness for consuming plant matter that had been deliberately burned. and something called sarcasm, that most alien species found either incomprehensible or mildly threatening. The Wanderer had developed their own version of that last trait through decades of dealing with cosmic bureaucracy, but they suspected it might not be quite the same thing. The hologram finally concluded its performance with a cheerful chime that somehow managed to sound condescending. "Pleasant travels, citizen. Remember, there's no place like home. There's no place like home." The Wanderer repeated, staring at the space where the hologram had been. "Right, except I wouldn't know, would I?" The cosmic irony was not lost on them. They had spent their life learning to adapt to every conceivable alien environment, mastering languages that existed in dimensions human vocal cords weren't designed to navigate, and developing a cultural flexibility that would have impressed professional diplomats. Now they were being sent to the one place in the universe where they were supposedly guaranteed to belong, and they had about as much cultural preparation as a solar flare had subtlety. The crystalline entity at the far end of the table chimed something that roughly translated to, "The universe has a sense of humor, and we are all its unwilling comedians." The Wanderer couldn't argue with that assessment. 24 hours. That was how long they had to prepare for a journey to a world that called itself home but felt more foreign than the crushing depths of a gas giant's atmosphere. The galaxy, it seemed, was about to teach them something about the arbitrary nature of belonging, whether they wanted to learn it or not. The departure lounge of Nexus Station resembled nothing so much as a cosmic waiting room designed by beings who had heard about the concept of comfort, but had never actually experienced it. The Wanderer sat on what the station optimistically called a bench, a crystalline formation that seemed specifically engineered to make every known species equally uncomfortable, and watched their fellow passengers with the sort of morbid fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. The transport to Earth was, according to the cheerful announcements, a cultural exchange vessel designed to facilitate meaningful interspecies dialogue during transit. In practice, this meant the ship was packed with the galaxy's most enthusiastic xenoanthropologists, amateur philosophers, and beings who had developed oddly specific theories about human behavior based on wildly inaccurate data. "Ah, a genuine Terran specimen," exclaimed a creature that looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a university professor and given the result an unhealthy obsession with taking notes. "How fortuitous. I am conducting research on primitive pack bonding behavior. Tell me, do you truly consume the fermented secretions of various plant organisms for recreational purposes?" The Wanderer considered explaining that they had about as much insight into human recreational habits as a quantum computer had into interpretive dance, but decided that honesty was probably not the path of least resistance. "I hear it's quite popular," they said instead, which seemed to send the mantis professor into raptures of scholarly excitement. "Fascinating. And the ritual of high-fiving, is it truly a dominance display, or merely a primitive form of mathematical verification?" Before the Wanderer could even begin to unpack that particular query, a gelatinous blob that spoke through carefully modulated gravitational waves had oozed closer. "Please excuse my colleague," it pulsed apologetically. "They have been preparing for this research expedition for 17 cycles and have developed some rather creative interpretations of human social customs." The blob's name was something unpronounceable that roughly translated to "the one who questions the obvious," until it becomes profound. But they had adopted the more manageable designation of Dr. Wave for interspecies interaction. They had spent the better part of 3 decades studying human psychology from a distance of approximately 4,000 light-years, which had given them a perspective on human behavior that was both impressively comprehensive and utterly divorced from reality. "I understand you are returning home after an extended absence," Dr. Wave continued, their gravitational signature radiating gentle curiosity. "This must trigger significant emotional responses tied to territorial recognition patterns and ancestral memory activation." The Wanderer nodded sagely, as if this made perfect sense instead of sounding like someone had fed a psychology textbook through a universal translator that had been having a particularly bad day. "Something like that," they agreed. The truth was considerably more complicated. The closer they got to Earth, the more aware they became of a fundamental disconnect between expectation and reality. Every species they had encountered had their own theories about what made humans unique. Their capacity for self-destruction, their bizarre relationship with their own mortality, their tendency to form emotional attachments to inanimate objects. The Wanderer had absorbed all of these perspectives like a cultural sponge, but none of them felt particularly relevant to their own experience. A crystalline entity that communicated through harmonic resonance had joined their impromptu discussion group, vibrating with what might have been excitement. I have heard that humans possess the ability to produce salt water from their optical sensors as an expression of emotional state. Is this accurate? Crying, the Wanderer supplied helpfully. Yes, that's a thing humans do. The crystal being practically sang with delight. Remarkable. Such an inefficient method of emotional regulation. And yet you have achieved interstellar flight. Truly, evolution operates in mysterious ways. The conversation continued in this vein for several hours, with the Wanderer serving as an inadvertent expert on a species they belonged to genetically, but had never actually encountered socially. They found themselves improvising explanations for human customs based on half-remembered alien anthropological studies, and their own best guesses. By the time the ship announced they were entering the Sol system, they had somehow become the unofficial authority on everything from human mating rituals to the cultural significance of caffeinated beverages. The blue planet grows larger in the viewing ports, observed a gaseous philosopher, who existed primarily as a sentient weather pattern. Does this trigger ancestral recognition protocols in your neural pathway? The Wanderer looked out at Earth, their first glimpse of the world that had supposedly shaped their species, and felt absolutely nothing that could be described as recognition. It was beautiful, certainly, in the way that any life-bearing world was beautiful when viewed from space. The swirling clouds, the vast oceans, the continental masses that spoke of geological processes spanning millions of years. But it might as well have been any other habitable planet they had visited during their travels. They began, then paused, searching for words that wouldn't disappoint their eager alien audience. It's very blue. Yes, nodded Dr. Wave with the satisfaction of someone whose theories had just been confirmed. The deep emotional connection to chromatic familiarity. Precisely as I hypothesized, the Wanderer decided not to mention that their most profound emotional connections were to the crystalline cities of Vega Prime, where light itself became architecture, or the nebular nurseries, where the cloud riders raised their young among newborn stars. Those experiences felt real in a way that this genetic homecoming did not. As the ship began its descent through Earth's atmosphere, the Wanderer realized they were about to face the ultimate test of their adaptive ability. They had learned to breathe methane, communicate through electromagnetic pulses, and navigate by magnetic field fluctuations. Now they would discover whether a lifetime of cosmic cultural immersion had prepared them for the one culture they were supposedly born to understand. The irony was delicious, in the way that only the universe's sense of humor could be. They were coming home to a place they had never been, to rejoin a people they had never met, armed with nothing but second-hand knowledge, and a collection of alien misconceptions about what it meant to be human. If this wasn't the setup for a cosmic joke, the Wanderer thought, then the universe had seriously missed its calling as a comedian. Earth's Immigration Processing Center existed in a state of perpetual bureaucratic chaos that made galactic administration look like a model of streamlined efficiency. The Wanderer stood in what humans optimistically called a queue, a concept that seemed to involve standing in roughly parallel lines, while maintaining the collective delusion that forward progress was not only possible, but inevitable. The human official behind the processing desk looked like someone had fed the concept of middle management into a biological printer and forgotten to include the instruction manual for enthusiasm. Her expression suggested she had seen everything the universe could throw at her, and found it all mildly disappointing. Purpose of visit? She asked in the tone of someone who had asked this question approximately 17,000 times, and had yet to receive an answer that surprised her. Mandatory cultural reintegration, the Wanderer replied, presenting their galactic documentation with the sort of careful precision they had learned was essential when dealing with bureaucratic entities across the cosmos. The official's expression shifted from bored indifference to active confusion, which the Wanderer recognized as a significant emotional escalation. "You're human," she observed, displaying the sort of keen analytical skills that had probably earned her this prestigious position. "Genetically speaking, yes. And you're here for cultural reintegration." The official stared at the Galactic documentation, as if it were written in a language that existed only in theoretical mathematics, which, given the GX approach to record-keeping, was entirely possible. "It says here you were raised by crystalline entities and gaseous philosophers in something called Cloud Riders of the Horsehead Nebula, among others." "Sir," the official said with the careful patience of someone explaining basic physics to a particularly confused quantum particle, "you do realize you're human, right? You're supposed to be here, on Earth, with other humans." The Wanderer considered explaining that belonging was considerably more complicated than genetic happenstance, but decided that philosophical discussions about the nature of cultural identity were probably not what this particular bureaucratic encounter required. "So I've been told." What followed was a processing experience that made galactic administration seem like a masterpiece of logical organization. Forms that referenced other forms that required supplementary forms that could only be completed after obtaining approval from departments that existed in a state of theoretical probability. The Wanderer was fingerprinted, retina scanned, DNA sampled, and subjected to a psychological evaluation administered by someone who seemed personally offended by the concept of alternative upbringings. "You've never celebrated Christmas?" the evaluator asked, making notes with the sort of aggressive pen clicking that suggested deep psychological trauma. "I've participated in the Festival of Stellar Convergence, the celebration of molecular harmony, and the great nebular dance of cosmic renewal." The Wanderer offered helpful. The evaluator's expression suggested these were not acceptable substitutes. The cultural orientation session was where things truly went sideways. The Wanderer found themselves in a room full of folding chairs that seemed designed by beings who had heard about the concept of sitting but had never actually attempted it themselves. Watching a holographic presentation about essential human values that bore no resemblance to anything they had learned about humanity from their alien friends. "Humans," the presentation announced with the sort of false enthusiasm usually reserved for selling interstellar timeshares, "are social creatures who form strong family units and maintain deep connections to their place of birth." The Wanderer looked around the room at their fellow orientation attendees, a collection of humans who had apparently also failed to demonstrate sufficient cultural compliance, and wondered if the presentation designers had ever actually met any human. The man next to them was reading what appeared to be a technical manual on quantum mechanics, while occasionally muttering things that sounded distinctly uncomplimentary about the entire process. The woman across the aisle was using the orientation period to conduct what appeared to be complex financial calculations on a device that projected numbers into three-dimensional space. Humans enjoy traditional activities such as barbecuing and watching sports, and small talk about weather patterns. The presentation continued, apparently unaware that it was describing a species that had managed to achieve faster-than-light travel, despite being primarily motivated by outdoor cooking and meteorological observation. When they finally released the Wanderer into the wild habitat of human civilization, the real education began. Everything was wrong in ways that were both subtle and profound. The proportions of buildings designed for bipedal creatures who had never learned to think in three dimensions. The bizarre insistence on conducting conversations while making direct optical contact, as if communication required some sort of ocular verification protocol. The seemingly random distribution of commercial establishments that sold products with names like coffee and donuts that bore no resemblance to any logical nutritional classification system. The humans themselves were the most confusing element. They moved through their environment with the casual confidence of beings who belonged there, navigating social interactions through a complex system of verbal and non-verbal cues that might as well have been an alien language. The Wanderer tried to apply their extensive experience with xenocultural adaptation, but every technique they had learned seemed to produce the opposite of the intended effect. Attempting to greet strangers with the respectful harmonic resonance appropriate for crystalline entities,
resulted in humans backing away with expressions of concern. Trying to establish conversational dominance through the subtle epigenetic field manipulation, preferred by gaseous philosophers, seemed to cause headaches. Even basic navigation proved challenging when every instinct they had developed told them to read atmospheric currents and gravitational variations rather than looking for street signs written in a single-dimensional plane. By the end of their first day on Earth, the Wanderer had inadvertently violated approximately 12 social customs, been refused service at 3 commercial establishments for reasons they couldn't begin to understand, and had been asked, "Are you feeling all right?" by concerned strangers more times than they could count. The final insult came when they attempted to find lodging for the night. The desk clerk at what humans called a hotel looked at their galactic identification with the sort of expression usually reserved for discovering that someone had tried to pay for interstellar transport with decorative rock. "This isn't a valid form of ID," the clerk explained with the patient condescension of someone addressing a particularly slow child. "It's recognized by 17,000 inhabited systems," the Wanderer pointed out. "But this is Earth." "Yes," the Wanderer agreed, "so I've noted." They spent that night on a bench in what humans called a park, staring up at stars they could navigate by but couldn't call home, and reflecting on the cosmic absurdity of being a stranger in the place where they were supposedly meant to belong. The universe, it seemed, had saved its best joke for last. The revelation came at approximately 3 in the morning, delivered by a street sweeper whose approach woke the Wanderer from dreams of crystalline cities and nebular storms. The machine moved with the methodical precision of automated systems everywhere, following its programmed route with the sort of single-minded determination that the Wanderer had come to associate with bureaucratic process. "You can't sleep here," said the human operating the sweeper, not unkindly but with the weary authority of someone who had delivered this message countless times before. The Wanderer sat up, joints protesting against the architectural hostility of park furniture, and looked at this representative of their supposedly native species. "Where exactly am I supposed to sleep?" "Somewhere else," the operator replied with the sort of practical wisdom that transcended cultural boundaries. "This is a public space. There are shelters if you need help." It was then that the cosmic joke finally revealed its punchline. Here they were, supposedly home, among their own kind, being told they didn't belong in a public space designed for their own species. Meanwhile, they had slept comfortably in crystalline chambers that would have killed most humans, found welcome in gaseous communities that existed at pressures that would compress organic matter into interesting geometric shapes, and been offered hospitality by beings who communicated through controlled stellar radiation. The universe's sense of irony was truly spectacular. The next morning brought a new approach to the problem. If the Wanderer couldn't belong to human culture through instinct, perhaps they could belong to it through the same adaptive strategies that had served them throughout the galaxy. Every species had their patterns, their unspoken rules, their methods of determining who belonged and who didn't. Humans, despite their apparent complexity, were probably no different. The breakthrough came in a commercial establishment that served the mysterious substance called coffee to creatures who seemed to require regular doses of stimulants to maintain basic cognitive function. The Wanderer approached the transaction with the sort of careful observation they had learned was essential when encountering new species. "What can I get you?" asked the human behind the counter, displaying the sort of practiced customer service enthusiasm that existed in a quantum state between genuine friendliness and complete indifference. "I'm not entirely sure," the Wanderer admitted. "I'm new to..." The server's expression shifted to something that might have been genuine interest. "Tourist? Where are you from?" "Everywhere," the Wanderer said, then realized this required clarification. "I mean, I've lived in a lot of places. Never actually been to Earth before." "Seriously, that's wild. So this is like your first coffee experience?" What followed was a detailed consultation that would have impressed professionals and cultural specialists. The server, whose name tag identified them as Alex, and whose enthusiasm for caffeinated beverages bordered on the religious, guided Wanderer through the complex social and chemical landscape of human stimulant consumption with the sort of patience typically reserved for teaching quantum mechanics to particularly bright children. "So you're human but you've never been to Earth," Alex mused, preparing something called a medium roast, with room for cream with the sort of ritualistic precision the Wanderer recognized from various alien ceremonial practices. That's actually pretty cool. Like you get to experience your own species as an outsider. Most people never get that perspective. This was the Wanderer realized exactly correct. They possessed something that most humans never achieved. The ability to see their own culture through alien eyes. The customs that seemed arbitrary and confusing to them were probably just as arbitrary and confusing to humans. They had simply never had the opportunity to examine them from an external perspective. The bureaucratic solution, when it finally emerged, was elegantly simple. The Wanderer appeared before the Cultural Compliance Review Board, armed not with attempts to demonstrate their humanity through instinctive behavior, but with a comprehensive comparative analysis of human culture as viewed through the lens of galactic anthropological standard. According to my research, they told the panel of officials who looked like they had been assembled from the cosmic supply closet of middle management, humans display remarkable adaptive flexibility, strong xenophilic tendencies, and an unusual capacity for thriving in environments that should theoretically be hostile to their evolutionary development. The panel members exchanged glances that suggested this was not the sort of cultural assessment they typically encountered. What I mean is, the Wanderer continued, humans are really good at not belonging places and making it work anyway. It's practically a species trait. I should fit right in. The logic was unassailable. Humans had spread across the galaxy by being adaptable, by learning to belong in places where they had never evolved to live. The Wanderer's experience was simply an extreme version of the same phenomenon that had taken humans from a single blue planet to 17,000 star system. When the compliance review concluded with official recognition of their cultural adequacy, the Wanderer faced a choice that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. They could stay on Earth, learning to navigate the strange customs of their genetic heritage, or they could return to the galaxy that had shaped them into who they actually were. The decision was easier than expected. Earth was beautiful, fascinating in its own way, and full of humans who were themselves learning how to belong in an expanding universe. But home, the Wanderer had learned, wasn't about genetics or birthplace or bureaucratic classification. Home was where you understood the rules well enough to break them creatively, where you could sleep safely among beings who made sense to you, where your presence was neither surprising nor unwelcome. As their transport lifted away from Earth's surface, carrying them back toward the crystalline cities and gaseous philosophers and cloud-riding nomads who had raised them, the Wanderer reflected on the cosmic education they had received. The galaxy had taught them that belonging was a choice, not a destiny, and that sometimes the most human thing you could do was to admit you were happiest living as something else entirely. Earth called it home, but they had never been born there in any way that mattered. They had been born in the spaces between worlds, raised by the galaxy itself and shaped by every species they had ever encountered. That was their true heritage, and no amount of bureaucratic insistence could change it. The universe's joke had a punchline after all, and it was this: sometimes the best way to understand what you are is to spend some time learning what you're not. The Wanderer smiled, settling back into their seat as the stars welcomed them back to where they actually belonged.